Good evening. I am County Executive Steuart Pittman, and welcome to Tuesday night with County Executive Pittman. Uh, I've got with me tonight the people from the Office of Plan and Zoning and our new Deputy CAO for Land Use, Lori Rhodes. So I have Steve Ziegler, who's our planning officer. Welcome, Steve.
Thank
I
you.
have Cindy Carrier, who does long range planning, which is the topic of tonight from OPZ, and Lori Rhodes, Deputy
Good evening.
CAO for Land Use. Um, so, in case people hadn't heard, we are about to release for public comment the long awaited Plan 2040, the General Development Plan for Anne Arundel County. When I made the decision to run for this office, I have to admit that it was mostly because I was frustrated about the way land use decisions were getting made in the county. And it was some combination of my own long history working, trying to do affordable housing and seeing that most of the housing being constructed in this county was luxury homes and suburban sprawl that was taking up a lot of the beautiful, beautiful land that makes up this county. And I just couldn't understand why this county couldn't get with the times and do what other jurisdictions were doing around the country and preserving open space, protecting the environment, and doing transit oriented development, getting cars off the road. And all I could see was more traffic, corridors that go through our county completely clogged up, schools becoming overcrowded, lack of infrastructure and services for the growing population, and just this blind attitude that the more we grow, the better we are, without any calculations of the costs of that growth, and without a lot of what I thought was planning. Um, and then when I started to look into it, I started to read the plans that were on the books, the 2009 General Development Plan and the small area plans from 16 communities around the county from the early 2000s. And I sort of scratched my head like a lot of people did and thought, these are pretty good plans. Why didn't we do that? And so here we are doing another plan. And I got to say, most of our residents don't trust land use plans. I'm not sure that I trust land use plans. And this whole thing has made me a little bit nervous because if we don't start getting it right on growth and development and figuring out what the future is going to be like in this county and protecting the natural beauty of this place, I'm not going to want to live here. My kids aren't going to want to live here. There's not going to be a place for anybody to live here, and it's going to be a mess. So we have to get this right. And when I came into this office, I didn't know how to get this right. It made me nervous. How am I actually going to deliver on something this big? Now, I have to say that one of the things I love about long range planning and looking to the future and creating a better future is that it's different from most politics. Um, it's not the partisan issues that people use to divide us. When we did forest conservation, for instance, it was very bipartisan support, and Democrats and Republicans both hate traffic, and we both know that we need good schools and good infrastructure. So what's great about it is that we step back from our everyday crises and we think about the better future that we all want. So that's kind of a fun process. And I think that's part of the reason why there's been a lot of community engagement in the planning process. Actually, pretty incredible community engagement that I think Cindy's going to talk some about because we've had so many community forums and this last round where we were in the middle of COVID and there was a plan to do a lot more community forums about what communities want their future to look like. We couldn't do the meetings, so created this Plan 2040 tool that was pretty amazing that people could go in and comment on the details of what was being considered in land use, and that's all been great. But eventually, you have to put out a document, and that's what's going to be going out tomorrow. And I don't expect most residents of this county to read this whole document. In fact, I have to be honest, I have not read the whole thing yet myself.
Mhm.
I've skimmed
Mhm.
through and looked at the parts that I care the most about, and I will get to the rest. But I've been briefed on a lot of it, and you can do the same. You can read the parts that interest you, um, and what's a little bit boring about these things is that there are certain state requirements that have to be met in a general development plan, and that takes up a whole lot of pages. And you have to talk, you have to integrate all of these other plans, and it doesn't always get to what we really care about. What excites me, and I have to admit, I didn't really get this until the last week when I started really sitting down with these three people and also with some residents. Residents, to be honest, who have been um, pretty critical of land use in the past, and even pushing our administration to do the best we can do. And the conclusion that I've come up with is that it's not even the plan itself and what it says that gives me confidence that we're going to get there. Um, it's that this plan has all of these mechanisms within it that require implementation. The implementation committees, both in regional plans that will be happening all around this county, 9 regions. Um, the fact that we're putting off the rezoning till after the regional plan. So the real power and the real teeth are in those regional plans, which are more localized. Uh, and that there's going to finally be in this county a comprehensive conservation plan. And that if we can get all the legislation through, a lot of what this plan does is it tells us that we should pass legislation to accomplish certain goals. It doesn't write the legislation, but it tells us where we should be going. If we can do that, we can be like some other counties where a piece of ground that is going to be developed or that a person wants to develop, the first thing they do is they assess the environmental features. And the plan has to work around those instead of going through those. And other jurisdictions can have done this, and you'll hear some, I think, tonight about what other jurisdictions have done. Maybe Steve Kaiser's been in a lot of them and can talk to some of that and how Anne Arundel has been different. And you're also going to hear some contrast between how we're looking at this now and how we're viewing this plan and implementation versus how it was done in the past by Lori Rhodes, who has worked for plan zoning in Anne Arundel County for many decades and has seen a lot of these plans come through and seen how the implementation was done or not done. And so I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be easy to turn the ship around in Anne Arundel County and that all of a sudden there's going to be no bad development, only good development, smart growth, transit-oriented development. There are probably going to be some projects that slip through the cracks that probably shouldn't. Um, but when you put all the pieces together and all the implementation, um, I'm starting to get a sense that we really are that Anne Arundel County could show the rest of the state and show our residents that um, you don't have to let the land speculators, the developers, make the planning decisions. Now that's going to mean that future politicians after me are going to have to do the right thing too. And that may mean we have to pass laws that limit campaign contributions from developers with applications pending so that the ethics piece of it is in place where it's not been. And it may be that residents are going to have to continue to organize in this county and hold their elected officials accountable to the vision that they set forth in these documents. But because of the way the regional plans are structured, and they go out into the future years, we're not going to stop planning and we're not going to stop implementing. We can't. So that gives me a lot of confidence. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass it on to Lori, who's going to give you some perspective. We'll have all four of us speak briefly, and then we have questions that have been emailed in, and there'll be more questions that come in on Facebook Live, Facebook in the comment section that will be forwarded to me, and we're gonna deal with some of those. And I have to say that during this comment period that's going to start tomorrow, we looked at it. It was going to be a 30-day comment period. We decided to extend it to 45 days because I know there are community groups out there that need time to not only look at the plan, but also to convene as groups to comment on what they see. So that'll be 45 days. But this is a time where all of us are going to be listening. And the team in OPZ has been working and running on fumes is what their boss has described it as. And so they're going to be able to take a little bit of breather while the community reads this, responds to this, and then they're going to come back with a rewrite revisions, 45 days. It goes to then the Planning Advisory Board, which is a group of citizens who've been appointed to look at things like this. And then it will go to the county council that has the ultimate authority to pass the plan. So pass it on to you, Lori.
Thank you, County Executive. Again, my name is Lori Rhodes. I'm the uh, Deputy Chief Administrative Officer of Land Use. And sadly, I have to say, the history when I worked in zoning for many, many years and actually collaborating with the Development Division, the plan, the GDP was not something that we focused on. I mean, we learned the code and the ordinances and all of the laws that we were regulating, but the plan was always described as something that was advisory. It was something that pretty much sat on the shelf. We didn't really look at it when we were reviewing our cases, and it's very disappointing, and that's something that we're definitely going to stop, because a lot of damage that was done without monitoring the plan, implementing the plan, causes a lot of irreversible damage, and that's something that we're going to change. We didn't have any monitoring in place to make sure we were following the implementation schedule. What we plan to do with Plan 2040 is going to be vastly different. We're already anticipating what we're going to do legislatively to implement Plan 2040. We have goals to look at all of the elements and make sure that we have regulations in place that's going to turn the direction of the past to make this place a better place for the county citizens. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to working with the county executive and doing.
Yeah, what we're looking forward to with you, Lori, is that you've been the person who has um, kept notes, all the things that you think should change over the years, and there are a lot of code revisions that are going to need to change. And some of it I have to be honest is I'm for one I'm not completely anti-development. I think we need to have improved quality of life and in communities and town centers where people can live, work, and shop and all that. And the development that we want to encourage, we want to actually approve more quickly, right? And we want to reduce the regulatory burden, and sometimes that means code changes. So to make it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing, and I know that you're the expert, you're the person who always goes before the county council and answers all the questions. So I'm glad that you're going to be leading that process for us.
I'm looking forward to it. It's
Yeah.
a robust plan, and we have to have robust legislation in order to implement the plan in the way we envision it to be. And that's something that I'm looking forward to doing.
Yeah, me too. So, Cindy, tell us what y'all been working on lately. Been busy?
Yes, we've been very busy. Um, Again, I'm Cindy Carrier. I'm the planning administrator for the long range planning section that has been working for, oh boy, nearly 3 years now on putting this plan together. Um, a typical update to a comprehensive plan generally is a three-step process, and that begins with identifying where you are and listening to what residents' values are, what their concerns and issues are since the last GDP was adopted. So we began in late 2017 with a series of 8 listening sessions. That input continued through 2018 with staff gathering input from individuals and groups, and then concluded in mid 2019 with a workshop hosted by Smart Growth America and a series of 17 visioning meetings. So all in all, we heard from over 1,500 people there were over 1,500 people who voiced thousands of comments on what was important to them or what concerns that they had that should be addressed in Plan 2040. The second step of that process is to define where you want to be. Most comprehensive plans use a 20-year planning horizon. A 23-member Citizens Advisory Committee was appointed to define this vision, 20-year vision, and have given many, many hours over the last 17 months in developing not only a vision, but giving input into the third step of the process, which is to define how you get to where you want to be. They've read background reports that are hundreds, if not thousands, of pages on the various elements covered in the GDP, received presentation by a 40-plus member project team, helped develop the region planning areas, the development policy area map, which is going to be in the preliminary draft plan that you'll see tomorrow, and gave input into the goals, policies, and strategies in the land use map. Due to the COVID pandemic, an online open house tool was developed to replace 9 public forums that we had planned to receive feedback on the preliminary draft land use map and the draft goals and policies. We received over 4,000 comments that were submitted by the public who showed support for the overall goals and policies, but an overwhelming support for the goals and policies and support for the overall land use plan. So a preliminary draft is ready for public review, released tomorrow. It not only builds on the foundation of the previous GDPs and small area plans, but reflects the thousands of voices heard during this process by promoting and protecting what makes Anne Arundel County the best place for all, including the Chesapeake Bay and its rivers, forest farms, and the quiet, peaceful neighborhoods. It lays out a policy framework that informs many of the county's future decisions on land use. Also on environmental protection, transportation, open space, agriculture, community facilities, historic preservation, housing, economic development. Very comprehensive. And is based on an integrated approach to sustainable development that considers the interaction of the environment, economy, and social equity. The plan has 2 volumes. Both will be available on our website. Volume 1 contains the vision and the vision themes. And these vision themes are integrated throughout the document in a very comprehensive set of goals and policies organized into 4 chapters. Those 4 chapters deal with all of the elements that I just mentioned, but they are broken down into natural environment, built environment, health communities, and health economy. It describes the region planning process and an approach for conducting the region plan process that will follow the adoption of the plan, and also includes strategies for executing the vision, goals, and policies, and an implementation plan that includes a schedule. Volume 2 is the background that supports Volume 1. It has a lot of information in it. As the county executive mentioned, we are required by state mandate to produce a general development plan, and there's a lot in it that a lot of people won't want to read. It's lots of words, but it's required. So we've kind of broken that out separate so that we can concentrate on the really important part, which is Volume 1 and what we're calling the action plan. So as I said, both of them will be available tomorrow on the county's webpage. There'll be a link so that you can provide your comments on the plan. So please share this with your friends and neighbors. After the 45-day comment period is over, or during the comment period, we're going to consider the comments and provide a recommended draft to the planning board. They'll hold a public hearing and then they'll make recommendations to the county executive, who will then forward the plan in the form of legislation to the county council to adopt. So that's sort of the timeline of the plan. Hoping to have it to the council by February, and I guess Steve Ziegler will talk about what happens after the adoption.
Sure. Thank you, Cindy. Again, this is Steve Ziegler. I'm the Planning and Zoning Officer. It's kind of unique for me to actually participate in work here. I've lived in the county for about 22, 23 years, but I've only been fortunate to be working with Mr. Pittman for the last 14 months. So I got to come in at the midpoint of the development of the GDP, and it's been a whirlwind of activity. So you've kind of heard some of the background. You've heard a bit of what Plan 2040 is. Let me stress, if you want to comment on the plan electronically when it comes out, that link for that is plan2040 at aacounty.org. We've had thousands of comments already come in on some previous efforts. We're expecting over the next 45 days a very, very large influx of different opinions, questions, comments, criticisms, and compliments on occasion. So in terms of what comes next, after the GDP is adopted, within that plan, there's a framework, what we're going to call concurrency management plan. You heard everyone talk about the importance of implementation. We're going to need to put together a citizen advisory committee that is charged with overseeing how well the GDP is being implemented. That concurrency management plan is basically providing that group and the public a report card, a blank report card, to evaluate the progress on implementation of the GDP. Hugely important. I mean, the people that are in this meeting tonight speaking with you, we have been a part of plans in the past that, and for lack of a better word, sit on the shelf. As professional planners, we don't like that. It's not good use of our time. It's not good use of taxpayers' money. So we have a professional vested interest in seeing that the plans that we work on get implemented. Some of the key things that will come out of this GDP, as you heard, we are not doing comprehensive rezoning immediately following the GDP. That was a decision that the county made about 15 months ago, and I think it was a very, very wise one, because we knew we had to develop a system of doing some number of region plans, smaller area plans within the overall county framework. The conclusion was 9 region plans were the appropriate number, and you'll see language in the draft GDP that talks about those fairly extensively. We have resources to be able to start 3 of the 9 region plans basically immediately after the adoption of the GDP. That is not to say that we won't be working on some background work before the GDP is adopted, but officially we will start working on region plans immediately following GDP. In order to help frame how those plans should be developed, we will also utilize a citizen advisory committee process to assist in guiding and providing feedback to the professional staff in the development of the plan. And one of the key things in how we get that CAC created, we will create a citizen advisory committee application process. It has not been developed yet, but we know we have to do it. We want interested people to apply to be a part of this. And what we will be looking for is diverse, enlightened futurists to assist us in developing these region plans. As a part of the region plan planning process, there will be an individual comprehensive rezoning process that goes with each one. And it's very likely that they'll be implementing legislation that goes with each plan. Can't promise what that would look like at this point, but it will probably be necessary to implement those plans. Additionally, with each one of the region plans, whether it's the original CAC or a new one, we will assign a citizen implementation advisory committee to, I'm going to say, help us be honest in implementing those plans. And I don't just mean planning staff, all the departments, the administration, and the county council. Again, nobody wants to produce plans that aren't implemented. This is a technique that has been used in other jurisdictions. It's worked well if the level of interest is kept up. But this CAC implementation group would be assisting the county at time of budget preparation, both operating and capital, taking on certain projects within that region that can be led or facilitated by citizen groups, and participating much, much more fully with, I'm going to say, county staff in being able to implement those plans. Really, really important. And I guess I want to end my portion on all three of our speakers, including the CE, have stressed again the importance of implementation. You're going to hear this over and over and over again from the county folks who are leading this effort. We want to see the plan that the council ultimately adopts be implemented. If there are things that aren't going to be implemented, perhaps it's appropriate to amend those plans so that that language isn't in there. We see the GDP and the region plans as being living organic documents. They are not meant to stay untouched for significant periods of time. The other thing I think you're going to see, along with the GDP and the region plans, there will be map changes, meaning zoning map changes. But there will also be a very large number of legislative changes designed to implement all of those plans. Some of those will be coming immediately following the adoption of the GDP. We're thinking in terms, the boss talked about it, a new mechanism for how we would regulate development. And he stressed the point that it's very important to understand the environmental features that actually exist on an individual piece of property. You know what? Through existing resources and site analysis and delineation on site, we can figure out environmental resources that are on every piece of property that's subject to a development application. What our goal is, those are identified and protected to the appropriate level so that any development that's proposed occurs in areas that are not environmentally sensitive. It's a technique that's been used in other jurisdictions very successfully, not in Anne Arundel County at this point, but it will have a marked difference in the way that we do development review and how we look at development applications. So those are kind of some thoughts that we have for how things went in the past, where we're at with the GDP, and some of the things that will immediately follow the GDP. So thanks for your time.
It's interesting that you say that about the kind of zoning where you look at the environmental features. And I remember hearing you call it performance zoning. It's a whole different approach. But I know that some people were hoping in this land use designation map that came out, that is sort of a precursor to zoning, but taking parcels of land and listening to what people say about what category it should be in, that some people were hoping, maybe expecting that we would be eventually down zoning a lot of land. And I know you've been in down zoning battles before in your career and made the recommendation that instead we look at this performance zoning so that we can take our values, take them to our county council, ask them to put them into legislation, and then use those laws to make decisions about which projects to approve and what to develop and what not to develop. Knowing the down zoning, every time you downzone a parcel, you've got a lawsuit on your hands, and there's a lot of questions about taking and constitutionality. And so you convinced me of that. I know I was sort of an advocate of downzoning some land at the beginning, and I think that the tools that you're talking about here make a lot more sense. So that's the kind of experience that that we hired, and that we've brought in folks who have worked in other jurisdictions and look at Anne Arundel County and scratch their head and go, why are 7 or 8 or more modifications on every project being approved when modifications are a way to circumvent the law? That is, it's been a shock to some that that's no longer the practice in our county under
Right.
this plan of zoning.
Right.
So we have questions here, and there are 3 that are on one area of the county. So I want to jump into that one first, and I'm going to read all 3 of these questions, and then we can answer them together. Route 3 corridor, surprise, surprise. Crofton, Gambrels. We know that that's a corridor in the county where development has not been planned well. An effort to have something that serves both as a highway and a shopping district and a residential district, and it just creates traffic and terrible traffic situation. So what, if anything, is being done to keep the degradation of the Crofton Gambles Route 3 corridor from getting any worse? That was Evelyn. I would like to know, this is Giovanni. I would like to know if anything can and will be done to control the overdevelopment along Route 3 in Crofton and Gambrels. I witnessed the destruction of the woods to the south and east of Conway Road, the Two Rivers development, which eliminated one of my favorite off-road bicycling trails. How many more natural habitats must we sacrifice? And then Carla really lays it on. Given the traffic, adequate public facilities, and overdevelopment concerns surrounding Route 3, as well as the county executive's former suggestion of a development moratorium, can you explain how the proposed GDP, which sets the stage for rampant development along Route 3, don't agree with that, but identified as a, in quotes, targeted development area, is compatible with solving the current problems we face in West County? That was Carla. So let me take the first crack at some of that, and then I'll pass it over. I think the first thing to make clear is that the draft and the land use designations map identified land into categories, and one of those categories is corridors. And we heard loud and clear when people said corridors should not be considered growth areas. And I agree. And we talked about that. And I know there's been some work on that language, that corridors should be something that is managed in regional planning. And I know that is the plan. And regional planning is where the community has the greatest voice. So if you're talking about the Route 3 corridor, clearly there was overdevelopment and there's huge traffic problems. I would love to have a development moratorium there. The lawyers are telling me, not so quick, Pittman. You're not. It's not going to hold up in court the way it is. I'm still talking to lawyers about whether there's a way to do this. I do have a little bit of good news, which is that I think we all know that state roads, both Route 2 and Route 3 corridors, state highways has had a plan for well over a decade. And every year the county executive sends the letter into the state prioritizing the Route 2 and Route 3 corridors to do something about the traffic problem, and asked for a new plan. There now is a plan. And what's new is that we have put into the budget for Route 2, 9.8 million, Route 3, 19.8 million in our new fund for permanent public improvements, so that we can go to the state and we can say, look, we're putting real money on the table. If we're going to put real money on the table, we need your commitment to do this project and manage this project. So we're negotiating with them right now on an MOU to get that commitment out of them. Of course, we're going to try to get as much of their money as we can, but the state's not been very generous with money for road improvements. But we're not going to wait. So we're going to move forward on solving the worst of those failing intersections on both of those corridors. I would love to see a development moratorium until that happens, and that's something that's still up for discussion, and we'll see where that goes. But so transportation is a big part of this plan. But is there anything else that you can say to really assure the residents of that area that this plan is not targeting growth to that corridor, and that they're going to have a voice in the future?
We can, and this is something that came out from a number of citizens in the area, and Cindy may need to correct me on some of my terminology, but we understand the language that we have used in the past when the draft full Plan 2040 comes out. That terminology is being removed from the plan, and we're now using an economic enhancement area designation. Correct, Cindy?
No, it's critical corridor.
Critical corridor? Okay, and it has a different meaning. It is not an area targeted for a lot of new growth. It's an area targeted where we can more properly deal with adequate public facilities. And I will say, part along that, I'm really, really glad to hear your news, boss, on where we might be getting with the state and the seed money that we can put into it, because that's hugely important to bringing some type of resolution to the area. I will say most folks don't know, but the county has two very large work group efforts underway that deal with adequate public facilities. One is on schools, which I chair. Another one is on roads APF, transportation, which Chris Phipps, who's the director of public works, is leading. And both groups are probably 2/3 of the way through their processes. There's been a lot of effort put into how we deal with adequate public facilities. So we're looking at all the code regulations as they currently exist to see what changes we can and need to make. We've also figured out that over the years, we have not necessarily applied the code as written as well as we could. There's a tendency in the regulatory process to review a project based on the way we looked at a project the last time, based on the way we looked at a project the last time, as opposed to actually reading the words that are the regulation. And the regulatory agencies who deal with transportation, which is primarily public works, inspections, permits, and the Office of Transportation, are now doing their reviews looking at the words as written, not necessarily how they reviewed a project 3 or 5 years ago. And that's a big help. So we're trying to, this is a part of listening. Dealing with Route 2 and Route 3 is not an easy task. There is, I can tell you from my experience, downzoning all the land along those corridors or a moratorium in the area of those corridors is not necessarily going to have any material impact on congestion or traffic flow because so much of it doesn't come from the land adjacent to it. So I like the idea that we're looking at the regs. There will be changes in those. I love the idea that we've been able to set aside a fairly large amount of money, which entices the state. That's what they want us to do as a way for them to come in and manage and help improve those intersections. Cindy, you want to talk a little more about the land use designation and what it really means in the plan for these areas?
Sure. So it's not really the land use designation; it's the policy area, and this particular policy area was defined because these are our what I would call commercial corridors. I mean, the corridors themselves are much larger than these policy areas, but these were where we have existing developed commercial. Commercial land use in the future is kind of up in the air, not only with COVID, but the things happening with the retail industry now. And so we know things will be changing. And our thought was, well, not all of these are alike. Route 2 and Route 3 in particular have um, more pronounced traffic congestion and mobility issues. But the other areas were also ripe for, some of them are ripe for redevelopment. Um, so these are not areas where there's going to be new greenfield development. These are existing developed areas that over time will most likely change. So our thought is keep the land use on the maps the way it is now and during the region plan process, work with the community and the stakeholders to define what they would like to see in this area and integrate transportation solutions with land use that'll make it work. So we've adjusted some of the policies, amended strategies, and focused more on relieving traffic congestion, increasing mobility in these areas.
Thanks.
So, yeah. And Lori, I know you've worked on development projects in that area and other growth management type areas or even none. Is it true that there's been that when a project would come in before as you were a development review person, right?
Yes, I worked in the zoning division for most of the time, but I am familiar with the development review projects as well.
So even without new legislation and without the new GDP, um, um, are things being denied that weren't? I mean, we have one comment here, and I'm going to read this one. Um, um, Oh, I can't find it now. Oh, here it is. Why, given your campaign promise of correcting the previous administration's seemingly unbounded development sprawl and now appearance of the new GDP that addresses that problem, does plan and zoning continue without pause to grant variances for construction or disturbances on steep slope properties in the critical areas along our rivers and waterways? The variance hearing officer or the administrative hearing officer continues to cite property owners' rights as overriding existing county regulations that are supposed to preserve forested properties. Is that going on, or is there any of that, or less of
We,
that, or what's really going
we've,
on?
we've made a lot of changes from our past practices, which was not to provide any rationale behind our analysis of the variance criteria. We now provide analysis. We actually use the Maryland Stanley Abrams zoning decisions as a guide. It provides guidance on criteria and evaluating variance criteria. That's what the zoning staff currently use. The problem with what we face is we could make a recommendation, a non-binding recommendation of denial to the administrative hearing officer, but the administrative hearing officer could either grant or deny, and then they can appeal that to the Board of Appeals, who could grant or deny. But what happens is the county is blamed for the approving authority's ultimate decision. But we have definitely beefed up our understanding. We actually are working with the County Office of Law on how we respond and analyze the criteria before we make a recommendation. So yes, we are.
So it's very interesting. So the perception is from the public that it's a decision-making process that occurs in the Office of Planning and Zoning. It does not.
Correct.
It occurs through a separate office that we do not control. We can make recommendations to. In the past, Lori will confirm, I believe, there were occasions that, depending on the issue, we didn't even make recommendations. We
Correct.
always make a recommendation now, and if we're recommending for denial, which does happen very frequently, we kind of go in loaded for bear because we know how historical decisions have been made. Sometimes it depends on the severity of the issue, but yeah, I think it's a great question because again, it's a perception in the public, and it's not the first time we've heard it, that planning and zoning is granting these variances, which is just it's not accurate. But the average citizen just does not know that.
As opposed to modifications, which are under your authority, right?
Modifications are under the authority of the planning and zoning officer, and that has been another sea change in how work occurs. We've had a modification, we've kept track of modifications as far back as 1983, and I think there's somewhere around 40,000 individual applications over those 40 years or so. Most of them came under multiple requests under one application. In the last couple of years, each application had to be an individual one, but many thousands. And historically, the county has approved about 95% of them. So the Office of Planning and Zoning is not without, we've contributed to the problem with modifications, but I will tell you in the last year and a half, there has been a very different approach to whether or not they're granted. For those citizens who want to see how we think, trying to be transparent, go onto our website and look at the green notices. There's probably 15 of them up there that also basically explains the thinking process we might use to consider a modification to disturb an environmental feature. Right. And if at the end of the day, the applicant can meet the criteria, which is very strict, what we try and do is get mitigation in a size, form, shape that actually improves the environment over the modification they may receive. That is also a new thing. Our development review staff spends about 40% of their time on modifications. Over time, we need to really weigh in much harder on modifications because it is a unique animal to Anne Arundel County. In my experience, no one else does it.
Yeah, we didn't want to modernize our laws, so instead we just work around them. And if you think about it, and from the stories that I've heard, it can be a very corrupt system. It invites corruption because there are developers who still think that they're supposed to call the county executive to try to get their modification, get their project through, and they're frustrated that I don't take those calls. I mean, I'll have a conversation with anybody to talk about policy, but to talk about your project and that you want something done special for your project, I think they're figuring out that it doesn't help to call me. That conversation doesn't happen. But if you think about a system like that, the planning officer works at the pleasure of the county executive, and the decision is made by the planning officer whether that project should get to circumvent the law. There are millions and millions and millions of dollars at stake. And so, what's a $6,000 campaign contribution from this LLC, that LLC, that LLC? I mean, there are developers who've done multiple LLC contributions, get the right person in office, and then they walk right into the office and make their request. And we cannot continue to have that system. So we change the rules, we change the system, and then no matter who's county executive, hopefully, won't get away with it.
Well, let me add one more real quick. What I think is important is because we've taken a much more strict approach to dealing with modifications, we get far fewer of them now. I think the development community as a whole, they gauge how we think, what decisions we make, and if they think they're on the losing side or we won't entertain it, there's a point where they kind of stop asking. So we get applications, new one that don't need modifications. Surprise, surprise, and it means for a better project, or midpoint in the application where it's clear we're not going to approve the mods, the project changes so they don't need them. I think that's a good thing for everybody, though.
Yes, the
Yeah.
thought process has changed, which is a good thing, for
Uh,
variances as
the,
well. Use variances, that should not even be a conversation.
Agreed.
I think the enclave at Crofton was a real wake up call and turning
Yes.
point. That this person was asking about steep slopes and wetlands, and this was exactly the reasons why that project was denied. And the developers just couldn't understand, the Hogan companies and their LLCs couldn't understand that no, different, we're actually applying the current law as opposed to doing it based on the way things used to be. And they actually, sent a letter to the Office of Law, saying that they were going to be, filing suit against me. They haven't followed up. But I think they're sort of figuring out that what we're doing is actually legal. And I think that these green notices are making it, making the decisions more clear so that they can have the certainty to make a business plan. If you know how your application is going to be reviewed, you know whether or not it's going to get approved, and you can make a business plan around that. You can't make a business plan around, hoping that the people making the decision will treat you specially.
Agreed.
Okay, let's move off of that, and let's jump up to. Okay, Susan says, I'd like to see the draft GDP in a form that is understandable. A script of what's planned would be easier to comprehend than the interactive map. I know some people love that land use map, and other people hated it because they. Um, but is this going to be readable? This thing that we're putting out tomorrow?
So I'm going to say, and then I like Cindy. I think it is. I frankly, as you've mentioned, I've been around the block. I've worked in a variety of places. This isn't my first GDP. In my humble opinion, this is the most professional effort I've ever seen produced, especially as a first draft. We need to remember this draft is not what will be adopted. We have a lot of listening to do. There'll be a lot of changes, and hopefully we'll reach a consensus as to what needs to happen. I think it's readable. But if you're not used to land use documents, they are really complicated. And trying to synthesize a 300-page document down into a 3-page executive summary and have it have value is really hard. But I'd like Cindy to jump in on this too.
Yeah, I'm actually very excited to share this. The staff has done a fantastic job of putting together the plan. As I said before, 2 volumes. One is the user friendly, lots of graphics, clearly states the goals, policies, strategies, and implementation plan. Talks about our commitment to measurement of the plan, which has not occurred before. And it, the second volume, which is several hundred pages, is a lot of words, but that's what we have to do. It's required. We will have on the web page links to the development policy area map, the the which includes the resource sensitive policy area, as well as the land use plan, so people can zoom in. It will be hard to read if you're looking at an 8.5 by 11 PDF, and even zooming in on that, it's going to be difficult. But, so we will have that available.
Well, I think it's readable too, and not only is the text in basic layman's terms. It's not like reading hard science, but the maps are awesome. The charts are awesome. There's a
Yeah.
map about just about everything, and if you love maps, it's fun. It breaks up the reading. So it's actually I agree. It's readable. Um, so let's see. I'm gonna John, and I know which John this is. You all can guess too. How do we lean harder into creating places where people can live, work, and play without daily car use? I know John rides a bicycle everywhere. That's John Corin. That's the best way to reduce traffic, protect the environment, and make the county a more attractive and affordable place to live. Who wants to take that one?
Well,
How about you, Laurie?
that's a tough one because it requires for people to change their habits, and we're trying to plan for the future and implement a plan for the vision. But how do we get into the minds of people and change the way that they view convenience, being able to jump in their car to go here and there? But then also you have to look at how plans were done in the past to get us where we are now in terms of sprawl, developments not having all of the mixed uses together where you have to get in your car to go to the store. So it's complicated, but that's why I'm an advocate for mixed use when it's done well. People can walk. I mean, I know I can walk to the store and get something within a mile from my house, but that's a difficult one because of the mindset of a lot of people and the convenience of being able to get into their car and go to a lot of places.
Yeah. I'm also going to say through Office of Transportation, Complete Streets
Hmm.
is, has a significant component to assist in this. I think it's also hard when you don't create new places from scratch and you're doing redevelopment or development in pieces and you're not assembling properties. It is hard, I'm going to say legally, to get the connection points to do, I'm going to say better bike ped arrangements. Complete Streets will help. I think within the next year, you'll see some legislation that's coming out of our transportation folks that will allow us to exact more out of the development community than we can today. But it's going to continue to be, I think, a struggle with the way that I guess it's our historical development patterns have put us in this place. The key is recognizing it. And then there's a part where you say, well, let's stop doing that dumb thing. And I think we're in that stage of it now and starting to develop the mechanisms that allow us to be more futurist. We have a long way to go. Let's be honest, though. Don's
Right.
absolutely right. It's something we should be striving for all the time.
Oh yeah,
Well,
definitely.
and he makes the point that if we can create places where people can live, work, and play without daily car use, then they're more inclined to use other modes of transportation, and that's um, we haven't talked about transit-oriented development, but we have train stations in this county that are surrounded by not much, not that could be surrounded by mixed use development, um, housing where
Yeah.
people can live, work, and play,
Yeah.
and live, work, and shop actually,
Oh yeah.
and not have to drive as much and use those trains. So I know that we've got the Greater Washington Metropolitan Committee is doing a study of transit-oriented development sites in our county, and we've given them the obvious ones. The Cromwell Station, end of the light rail, is one just north of Glen Burnie. Odenton Town Center, very clearly opportunities there, and even out by Laurel, where if they improve that train station there, are all
And
part of doing the
Plan
development to make the
2040,
train.
I
That
said
what?
Plan 2040 provides for these opportunities. Transit oriented, points out, some
Right,
of the mechanisms,
right,
but the, as was
yeah,
pointed out, the issue is going to be implementation.
yeah. And
Yeah.
the trick is moving the market, is getting the developers um, to want to go and do that kind of development, and not to do the sprawl development that
Right.
has gobbled up a lot of our land. And
You
and
know, many of the modifications that I've seen have been a modification to reduce both active and passive recreation on the site because it interfered with the yield the developer was asking for. And so it was fairly common for us to grant those modifications. So we made conscious decisions in the past not to preserve the land that could be used for these connection points because someone wanted to develop them.
yeah.
And we're getting much better at not agreeing to that.
Okay, I got one for you. And this, I think they're partly relating to some legislation that is before the council or has been recently. I know that there are those who say that we shouldn't do land use legislation until after the GDP, because the GDP will make recommendations on land use legislation. But it's usually because they don't support that piece of legislation. If it's a piece of legislation you want to get it done yesterday. If it's a piece of legislation you don't want, you want to push it off. But you know, not everybody agrees on all legislation. So we've had some of that. But this person says, Susan, I'd like more information about workforce housing and agritourism. Specifically, I'm interested in the impact of on the environment. How many trees will be cut down? How does it affect the bay? Is there increased traffic pollution, no matter how worthy a cause, such as workforce housing or preserving farmland, may be? So let me say something about both of the most recent bills on that. You know, workforce housing to me has some value in that we need housing at various income levels if we are going to have an economy and a society that works. There has to be a place for people who work in hotels and restaurants at lower wage jobs. Otherwise, they have to transport in and out of the county to work here, and it's really hard to get people to work. And so there's inherent value in that. You know, I'd like for my kids to be able to live here when they get out of college and can't afford a lot, and you know, older people move into smaller housing and all of that good stuff. We all understand that. Um, but in addition, there is this concept of density is not always a bad word. That you can do higher density, especially mixed use, is what we've been talking about with smart growth, in order to preserve other land and get cars off the road. So the most recent bill that had to do with workforce housing was introduced by Councilwoman Lacey. It wasn't part of our overall strategy, but I thought it made a lot of sense because what it allowed is in mixed use development, it allowed that office space component in a time when the market for office space is going through the floor because of people working at home, and there will probably people believe that will continue, to allow some of that space to become, it's usually going to be apartments, to become housing, along with the retail that's part of it. And so it's redeveloped. It's already developed. It's already going to be developed. The land. It's already zoned for mixed use development. So to me, that makes sense, and it's not adding to the development. It's not upzoning in any way. It's just creating that flexibility to respond to the market. On the agritourism, I've been a little confused by some of the comments on agritourism. The current bills on agritourism um, are what I call upper limits bills. So I don't know if people remember in 2017, I was very involved because you know, I'm a farmer. So, and I was on the board of Farm Bureau and got involved under the previous administration. And there was this idea that agritourism was going to be this big savior of agriculture. I don't believe it is. I think a small number of farms were doing stuff, and you know, there were really no laws or guidelines or limits on what they could do, so everybody just turned the other way. It's on a farm, and everybody was happy with that. And so a lot of the farmers were a little bit nervous about creating laws around agritourism because it was going to limit, it was regulation. But they ended up, you know, going along with it, and created some guidelines that allowed for events that were questionable before on farms. And when the legislation passed in 2017, Laura, you remember this very well,
Yes.
that communities around those farms and residents of those communities, some people were concerned that it was going to create traffic and it was going to create noise, because these are you know, activities that aren't. I mean, even though they have to be secondary to the farm operation. They're supplementing the farm income. That there were concerns. So the Shoe administration at the time said, go ahead and let's pass this bill. It passed 7-0. We will come back and create some upper limits, some restrictions on how frequent they can have those activities and how large those activities can be and whether they have to be on collector roads or what kinds of roads. And so this bill is that work. It's creating those upper limits. And what's a little bit amusing to me is that there are some people who think that this is permitting these activities. Well, they're already permitted. There's just no limits on how big they can be. Now we're putting the limits, and there's a perception that, oh, we're permitting them and they weren't allowed before. So I think when people really look at what's on the books now and what we're proposing is we're putting the upper limits on that people asked for. And I think people will feel better about it. But yeah, agritourism could get out of hand. I mean, I remember I opposed wanted to be extended at one point so this haunted house operation could move from Baltimore City and move to buy a 5-acre piece of land and run their haunted house operation and call it agritourism. And that ain't agritourism. No farmer thinks that agritourism.
I'm aware of that one. Yep.
Yeah, the haunted house.
Bennett's curse.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we do have to watch out and make sure that there's limits and that it really is about agriculture and that it does not, that, farmers know in this county, you got to be a good neighbor. You got neighbors surrounding you. It's not like being out in Iowa and there's nobody for 20 miles. So it's important legislation. We know from the bill that passed that very few farms have actually started doing any kind of agritourism, asked for permits to do it as a result of that legislation. They would have been doing it already because nobody was really paying attention. And so hopefully there'll be some good activity. And I think it brings people onto farms and makes them appreciate agriculture and open space just the way water access allows people to appreciate the Chesapeake Bay and support clean water. So I don't think it has a negative impact. I think it has a positive one. That's my own view.
Well, I think we agree. I'm going to ask Lori to step in a bit, but I'm going to say that when I got here, we had been working on this for 18 months, and I think we were struggling, and I don't take any personal credit for it, but what happened was, through Lori, and I don't know if people realize what a good researcher she is, but extensive amount of time looking into other jurisdictions, best practices, and I recall a lot out of Frederick, a lot out of Loudoun, for areas or county governments that, in a way, that weren't that dissimilar from us, who had established upper limits. And what we did as staff is kind of pulled out what we thought were the best of those. And I can tell you, over umpteen meetings with the agriculture community, the Farm Bureau, all of them, very challenging discussions, negotiations as to what would be an appropriate threshold. And I think at the end of the day, it was a fantastic collaborative effort. And at the time that the Ag Commission kind of voted on this, it was a unanimous vote. And I think we all felt we did a fantastic job of working to the middle, where now, you said it perfectly, boss, we didn't have any standards.
Exactly.
And no one was proposing these uses. Now we have standards. The uses that come out of these bills are not, we think, not so extensive. We're not going to have 500 wineries and farm stays, and it just, there isn't a market to that degree, but it offers people who own these larger tracts of land, these farms, more flexibility.
Yeah,
well, you should add something in here. You were the architect of that.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the agritourism bill that was passed in 2017, the only limit is the definition, and the definition just describes the use. There really aren't any conditions to that use. So we definitely made sure we wanted to balance this use with keeping farms economically viable. We wanted to make sure we had setbacks and certain things in place, hours of operation for certain uses, and thresholds that don't exist currently in the code. So, I mean, a lot of misinformation is out there about how many sites they believe will be used, but we haven't received any complaints regarding agritourism related uses to date that I'm aware of.
I got one for you. What is the Green Infrastructure Master Plan? Oop, sorry. Can you hear that buzz? Or do I sound
Yes.
okay?
Maybe.
I've got my speakers buzzing at me. Okay. What is the Green Infrastructure Master Plan and is it a part of the GDP? I worry that there's very little consideration given to environmental preservation in what I have seen to date in the GDP work. Emily.
Cindy?
Yep, sure. So, well, first, I think once people read the GDP, they'll find there's a lot of work that's been done on the environment. There's a lot of goals, policies, and strategies addressing environmental protection in the plan. But the Green Infrastructure Plan is not yet adopted. It was in preparation when we started the update to Plan 2040, and with staffing constraints, put that on hold. It was going to be an update of the 2002 Greenways Master Plan. So it was going to build on that. The 2002 Greenways Master Plan was done at a time where we didn't have the ability to use GIS layers. It was actually done by a consultant. But so it's going to refine the plan and make it a little more accurate. It looks out, along the areas that were described, and it's a ecological based plan. So it takes into consideration corridors, wooded areas that are at least 200 feet wide in the county, typically along the stream valleys, connects to hubs that are at least 250 acres. So it builds on that plan. And we're hoping that once Plan 2040 is adopted, that we can move forward with updating this Greenways plan and it'll become what we're calling a green infrastructure plan.
Well, we're making it a comprehensive conservation plan, right? So it'll be more robust. Yeah, one of the things that was frustrating to me and many was that the greenways from 2002 were really not respected. And when we first introduced our forest conservation bill, we tried to prevent any deforestation in greenways. That was not approved. We ended up compromising with, was it a 75 acres contiguous?
Yeah.
Yeah, 75 acres contiguous would be, because that Greenway plan had been so decimated that nobody respected it. So we said, okay, 75 acres of contiguous, and you can't do the deforestation, and which was helpful. But I think that the final compromise on the bill, that the one that the council actually approved, that we had to accept amendments that we didn't support. One was a grandfathering clause, and so some projects got grandfathered through that would have been impacted by that 75 acres of contiguous, and they'd already had their applications in. So it's a constant struggle trying to protect the environment when you have so many powerful interests that are working to try to protect their pocketbooks.
You're right. Think about it this way. That was a plan that was adopted in 2002. Very strong policy language, policy. What we failed to do was draft and adopt the implementing legislation code that would implement that policy. Imagine if we would have had that legislative oomph starting immediately following the adoption of that plan. And that's partly when we talk about implementation, we can't produce planning documents that we aren't willing to implement. My point is, if you're not willing to implement it, don't adopt it.
Interesting. So when we ask the county council to pass this GDP, we're asking them to say that they will pass the legislation that's recommended within it.
Yeah.
Which gives the community and anybody who supports that legislation a real handle. You can't force them to vote for it because they're elected, and ultimately it's the democracy that and the elected representatives that rule. But it does. I hadn't thought about it that way. That if you pass the GDP with that in there, then you're indirectly saying that you're going to support the recommendations.
Agreed. And
Yes.
if we refuse to adopt the implementing legislation, my position is then we should go back and amend the GDP or a region plan to take out that policy recommendation, which will be very difficult for everyone.
Exactly.
Again, you know, it's giving ourselves a report card. If we're gonna write,
Yeah, we get an F. We get an F if we refuse to adopt.
Right.
Yep.
Because that plan informs the legislative process. You're not just
Right,
doing it
and that's why
willy-nilly.
that's why it's so important for the residents of this county to know their GDP and use
Mhm.
their GDP and
Exactly.
eventually their region plans. I know that a lot of residents use their small area plans, but they were always told, oh, those don't have teeth, those are just recommendations. But yeah, if people know it and they use it, in my old community organizing days, we would call it an organizing tool, so that you bring people together around it, you create the political pressure to do it, and you make it impossible for the politicians to say no.
Right.
So, yeah.
Then when you go to the
Well,
legislative table, you start by saying, this
yeah.
legislation will implement policy E-12, and this is how we're going to do it.
You know, I think we should end on that because, well, first of all, because we said we were going to go for an hour and it's 15 minutes past the hour. And also because it really does, it does send a signal back to the residents of this county that you know, your leaders can't do this alone, and if you believe in it, fight for it. We can make it happen. This is a tool you can use. Make sure it's the right tool. We got 45 days to tell us whether or not it's the right tool, whether you want changes in this tool, and then it goes through the legislative process once it gets past the PAB. So I love this stuff. I hope other people are paying attention and loving this stuff, because we can really we can secure a better future if we do this right.
Exactly.
So yeah. So we're looking forward to hearing everybody's comments. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. We got to a lot. We merged some. But what's the email? It's plan2040@aacounty.org, right?
That's it.
Yes.
Yep. And it'll all end up with the right place, especially if it's a comment on the GDP. So,
And I'm going to say, please use that email address. If you send it to Steve Kai Ziegler or Lori Rhodes or the county executive as an individual one, we have to remember to move it into that, I'm going to say, database. Everybody gets to see everything, but please use that email address if you're going to comment.
great.
There'll actually be a survey on our webpage. That'll link it.
Okay, so they'll see the draft GDP if they go to Plan2040 at aacounty.org, the website, they'll see the actual draft GDP to comment on, and then there'll be a link to a form to use to comment. Great. Good. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
This is our roadmap to make Anne Arundel County the best place for all.
Best place for all. Exactly. Good
All
night.
right. Good night.